The morning sun shimmered off the glassy lake, throwing golden ripples across the water. A crowd of neighbors stood in stunned silence along the shoreline, their eyes fixed on the 6-foot wooden fence I had just finished installing. It stretched like a scar straight through what used to be our pristine, shared waterfront, slicing lawns in half, cutting to the community dock, even blocking water access altogether. On one side, Karen Fitzgerald's cousin Margaret stood slack-jawed. Her pricey lounge chairs and the jet ski ramp she had insisted on installing now sat trapped behind my freshly bolted wall of lumber. On the other side, I calmly tightened the last bolt, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and gave the gathering crowd a cheerful wave. But to really understand how things came to this, we need to go back. The dream home. 5 years earlier, I bought my dream home in Willowbrook Estates. The selling point wasn't just a house. It was the deeded lakefront rights. My property included permanent, shared access to a sandy beach and a community dock where my kids loved to swim, fish, and spend endless summer hours. It was everything I'd wanted. Paradise, worth every cent of the premium price. That was before Karen Fitzgerald became our HOA president 6 months ago. The reign of Karen. If you've ever wondered what happens when someone with a Napoleon complex is handed a clipboard and a sliver of authority, Karen was your answer. Within weeks, she was cracking down on grass height, declaring wind chimes a form of noise pollution, and demanding written requests for any flower planting not on her personal approved list. But what really set her apart was nepotism. Her brother-in-law became the HOA's paid landscape inspector. Her best friend landed the pool maintenance contract, and when her cousin Margaret came to visit, Karen apparently decided that HOA rules were more like suggestions. Margaret's takeover. The first red flag came on a Tuesday morning. I walked outside and found Margaret staging what looked less like a lakeside visit and more like a resort expansion. She had workers hauling in professional-grade lounge chairs, setting up tiki torches, and wiring an outdoor sound system. To top it off, they were building a private jet ski ramp right on the shared waterfront. The setup completely blocked my family's access to the beach and ruined our lake view. I approached with a polite introduction, only to be met with a look of disdain. Margaret dismissed me with a wave of her manicured hand. "This area has been reassigned for my exclusive use during my visit," she said, pulling out a sheet of paper like it was a royal decree. According to her, Karen had decided that I was underutilizing the space and that she needed it for her book club parties. The document was something called an easement reassignment, filed just 3 days earlier. Supposedly, the HOA board had unanimously voted to grant Margaret temporary exclusive use of half the waterfront. The problem? I knew for a fact 2 board members were out of town that week. Something stank, and it wasn't the lake, the paper trail. I immediately called the city planning office, then the county record department. Both confirmed what I already knew. The waterfront wasn't controlled by the HOA. It was deeded to individual lots, mine included. Changing those rights would require signed consent from every affected homeowner, not some flimsy HOA paperwork. Karen's little reassignment was legally worth about as much as a doodle on a napkin. When I presented this at the next HOA meeting, Karen's face turned a shade of purple I didn't think humanly possible. Clutching the podium with white-knuckled fury, she shrieked that the board had amended its bylaws to include waterfront management. Anyone who interfered, she announced, would face fines of $500 a day. She even waived another suspicious document claiming this change had been approved during a special meeting. Funny, not a single homeowner besides her seemed to remember that meeting ever taking place. The last straw. Meanwhile, Margaret had turned the once peaceful lakefront into her personal party zone. Music blasted from dawn until long past dusk. Guests left beer cans and trash scattered across the beach. The jet ski ramp violated at least 3 environmental ordinances. The final blow came when my 8-year-old daughter tried to walk down to the water for her morning swim. Margaret blocked her path and sneered, telling her this was now private property. My little girl came back in tears. That was it for me. The lawyer strikes back. As a contracts lawyer, my best weapon has always been paperwork. For the next week, I dug through everything. my purchase agreement, property surveys, the HOA charter, and decades of meeting minutes. The truth was simple and damning. The lakefront access wasn't just shared. It was irrevocably deeded to specific lots, including mine. The HOA charter itself even spelled out that the board had zero authority over deed rights. Any attempt to alter them made board members personally liable for damages. I drafted a formal notice to both the HOA and Margaret. They had 72 hours to remove every personal item from the waterfront and restore community access. If not, I would pursue full legal action to protect my rights. I sent the notice by certified mail and email, then sat back and waited. The response came the very next morning, and it was exactly what I expected. Karen arrived at my doorstep, Margaret in tow, and some man who claimed to be a lawyer, but looked more like he'd gotten his legal education from binge-watching TV courtroom dramas. They tried every tactic in the book: threats, intimidation, even bribery. Karen offered to waive my HOA dues for a year if I would be reasonable. Margaret, with a magnanimous air, said she'd allow my family to use the lakefront on alternating Wednesdays. The lawyer mumbled something about adverse possession and squatters' rights, which actually made me laugh out loud. When I politely declined, then revealed my own legal credentials, the trio stormed off in a fury, Karen shouting over her shoulder that I would regret crossing her. The 72-hour deadline came and went. Margaret, instead of backing down, doubled down. She added more furniture, expanded her setup, and even started construction on a permanent shade structure. That was fine by me. It was time for Phase 2. Drawing the line. I hired a professional surveyor to mark out the exact property lines of the shared lakefront. The results were crystal clear. The deeded access was split precisely down the middle. Margaret's sprawling insulation wasn't just encroaching. It was blatantly sitting across both sections, trampling legal boundaries like they didn't exist. Armed with the survey, I made a stop at the local building supply store. The teenage clerk's eyes nearly popped out his head when I explained how much fencing I needed and where it was going. In a small town, word spreads fast. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing with curious neighbors asking if the rumors were true. Was I really about to fence off the lakefront? Yes, I told them simply. Just marking my legal property lines. Nothing more, nothing less. The fence. At dawn the next morning, I arrive at the lakefront with a professional crew, permits in hand, survey markers in place, and truckloads of lumber at the ready. By 6 a.m., panels were going up. The fence line ran straight and true, from the property edge down across the beach, bisecting the dock with mathematical precision, and stopping at the waterline. It was a sight of pure symmetry, a wall of justice. At 7 o'clock sharp, Margaret stumbled out of her house with a coffee mug, just in time to watch the panels close her lounge chairs off from the rest of the world. The mug slipped from her hands and shattered on the ground as she unleashed a shriek that probably startled fish 3 counties over. Minutes later, Karen stormed down the path in her bathrobe and curlers. By then, half the neighborhood had gathered, waiting for the show. And what a show it was. The meltdown. Karen went into a full meltdown, accusing me of vandalism, trespassing, harassment, and bizarrely identity theft. She called the police. They arrived, looked at my permits and survey, shrugged, and left. She called the city inspector. He confirmed the fence was fully compliant with code. She called the mayor, her congressman, and if I had to guess, maybe even the White House hotline. Each call ended the same way, with Karen's voice climbing an octave higher in desperation. Meanwhile, Margaret faced her own humiliations. Half her jet ski ramp was now useless. The speakers she installed were literally cut in two, and the shade structure she started building had support posts on both sides of the fence, rendering it an expensive, pointless monument to her arrogance. Her construction crew quietly packed up and left as she stood there, mouth opening and closing like a stranded goldfish. The HOA revolt. That night, the HOA called an emergency meeting. It was standing room only. Karen had gone all out, printing flyers calling me a neighborhood terrorist who was destroying property values and community harmony. But as soon as she finished her trembling tirade, the tide shifted. First, Tom Harrison, a retired judge, stood up calmly. He explained that Karen and the board had not only overstepped their authority, but also exposed themselves to personal liability. Then Sarah Chun, whose flower garden Karen had bulldozed in one of her so-called beautification projects, presented her own research. One by one, neighbors spoke, each with their own grievances and legal findings. By the sixth homeowner, the mood had shifted completely. The room erupted in calls for Karen's resignation. The final blow came when Margaret's husband arrived from out of state. One look at the fence, the wreck setup, and his sobbing wife, and he made an executive decision. They were leaving immediately. I overheard him mutter that Karen had dragged them into an expensive disaster, and they were finished with a whole ordeal. The end of the tyrant. Karen wasn't ready to give up. With a last gasp of authority, she announced that as HOA president she was issuing an executive order for the fence's removal. That's when the HOA's own attorney finally spoke. He looked weary, but his words carried weight. Karen had no such authority. In fact, her actions had already exposed the HOA to lawsuits. The board, he warned, needed to take immediate action to protect themselves. The vote was unanimous. Karen was removed as HOA president on the spot, but that wasn't the end of her troubles. The board also voted to pursue legal action against her for misusing HOA funds. It turned out she'd been funneling association money to pay for Margaret's bogus easement paperwork and padding her brother-in-law's landscaping invoices. A forensic audit confirmed the worst: embezzlement, fraud, and financial abuse. Justice served. 3 months later, Karen stood in front of a judge, mascara streaking her cheeks as the verdict was read. Guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Her sentence: 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and restitution of $47,000 to the HOA. The judge made it clear. Her abuse of power for personal gain was a serious betrayal of trust. As the gavel fell, Karen collapsed into her attorney's arms, sobbing, finally realizing that her reign as the neighborhood tyrant had cost her everything. And on the shoreline of Willowbrook Estates, the fence still stood, a quiet, sturdy reminder that even the most arrogant bullies eventually fall.